Hello, welcome to Spain, and specifically Madrid's bustling Mercado de la Paz. Now, this produce here will soon end up on the plates of hungry Madrid residents, people well used to fresh fruit and veg in what is the European Union's second biggest farming nation by area after France. Now, one major difference between these two agricultural giants is that Spain is by far and away the EU's biggest grower of GM, or genetically modified crops, whereas zero is grown in French soil. Now, fans of GM say that farmers who grow the insect-resistant maize that's authorised here use fewer pesticides and have better profits. However, detractors claim that GM crops contaminate regular maize, that many growers use just as many chemicals, and the long-term costs outweigh the short-term profit. Luke Brown has been investigating for us.
This is MON 810, the only genetically modified crop grown in large quantities in Europe. Joan Maria Portajosa has been proudly growing this maize for 2 decades.
We succeeded in reducing the pest damage a great deal. When it comes to one of these pests, the so-called corn borer insect, well, we've reduced it up to 80%.
Insect-resistant, increased yield, MON 810 has won round Joan, even if the price is higher.
There is only one advantage. The difference is the pest protection. The GMO is 20 to 25% more expensive.
Joan has been farming here for over 50 years. He sees GMO as vital to saving farming in Catalonia, which was ravaged by insect infestations. But now consumers are unwilling to buy products labelled GM, so Joan and other farmers here have had to cut back. From 70% GMO, he's now at 15%.
If they banned GMOs here, I would be the first to protest against the ban. Here, we're very vulnerable to a return of the pests that would affect us severely. The only protection we have is this genetically modified maize.
Since 2015, the amount of GM crops in Spain has fallen by nearly 1/5. For the local branch of Spain's largest farming union, genetically modified crops have helped prevent a rural exodus and need to be promoted.
We can't close ourselves off. Most of the time, the environmental pressure serves only to close doors. We're a free country, and we need to keep the doors open.
95% of Europe's genetically modified crops are grown in Spain. Even within Spain, 4 regions have declared themselves GM-free. But for the rest of the country, farming in the shadow of GMOs is unavoidable, even though coexistence is supposed to be enshrined in EU law.
The situation in Spain is that this public register is not functional at all, because the authorities are only giving the hectares per municipality, and this information is not helpful.
Those challenges are part of everyday life for the Salel Organic Cooperative. Here they produce organic animal feed. To guarantee their organic label, the maize is tested to ensure no GMO gets into the food chain, or they face financial penalties.
A contaminated product has to be withdrawn from the market. If it is contaminated, the farmer can demand compensation from us because his product has lost value. It's serious.
Organic farmers have had to adapt planting cycles to avoid contamination. But the potential pitfalls have simply pushed many to abandon organic, leaving the consumer with even less choice.
The problem for the consumer is that they have to pay more for the organic product, and it has to be transported from further away because we don't have so much here. If there were less genetically modified crops, there would be more organic producers.
Due to the tight controls, GMO production in Europe represents less than 1% of the global total. But the EU rules are looser when it comes to imports. 34 million tons of GM soya are imported each year for animal feed.
Well, we've brought you now to Spain's oldest agronomy school. You can see inside this greenhouse the students carrying out some research projects on these plants right now. We're here to meet an agricultural economist, Tomás García Azcarad. Hello, thanks for being with us.
Hello, it's nice to meet you.
Now, I ought to say as well, you're an expert in European agricultural policy, and to prove it, you're a member of the French Académie de l'Agriculture, no less.
Yeah.
Well, let's start off with things right here in Spain. Why have GM crops boomed in Spain and not the rest of Europe?
Well, 30% of the corn production is GM corn is GM in Spain, just because the Spanish governments, and I insist on S, left and right, have always believed that if it has been allowed by the health and environmental authorities in Europe, has to be allowed for cultivation in Spain. And I think the big difference is on the public opinion. The Spanish public opinion is less aware or nervous, depending on which side of the board you are, aware or nervous about the GM issue and about the product which are coming from animals who have eaten GM product.
Well, I've seen research, for example, that claims that GM maize has generated more than 285 million euros extra income for farmers since it was authorised here in 1998. But that research, like much of the research on GM, was funded by a biotech federation.
Well, this research is based on a real fact, is that the expected yield of a GM product, of a GM corn, is higher than a non-GM due to insect attacks. The real question in a long-term perspective is a fact that Spain, in particular, is a deficit area in cereals, that there is a real demand, a real growing demand for non-GM product, that the traditional producers of standard basic GM product, Ukraine and South America, are competing in the commodity market. And the big question is, do you want to compete in the commodity market at a commodity price? My belief is that the future of European agriculture is not producing commodities, it's producing specialized products as much as possible.
As the new version of the EU's common agricultural policy is being negotiated right now, there is a big push, particularly by the Greens, to reorient Europe away from this industrialised agriculture. Is that desirable, and how long might it take to happen?
We will see the result of the new Green Deal in Europe beginning of the next decade. But it's a real move, and it's a real moving to what I said just at the beginning. The future of European agriculture is not on commodity market. The future is on specialty quality product.
Tomás García Azcarad, thank you so much for being our guest.
Many thanks, it's a pleasure.
Well, the EU's member states might hold their noses at the idea of growing GM crops in their own soils, but they are perfectly happy to import it, and in great quantity. The #1 seller is neighbouring Ukraine. However, problems of corruption and lax regulation there mean that restricted and even banned pesticides and GMOs can find their way into the food chain. Gulliver Cragg reports.
The farmland of southern Ukraine is among the most fertile in the world. The famous Black Earth.
It's grainy, which means moisture and air penetrated well, and crops can get the maximum amount of nutritional substance from this soil without adding any chemical fertilizers.
Ukraine harvested a record 35.8 million tons of corn last year. But though the Black Earth may not need fertilizers, its farmers do use pesticides, and not always legally.
The share of illicit pesticides in the market is in between 20 to 25%.
But there are severe penalties if any traces of those are found in exported grain, and destination countries always check.
The trader who supplies goods with low-level quality with some pesticide residues can be banned. Another issue is that if the country receives many notifications for low-level inspection, then the entire country can be banned.
Malkov says the strong motivation to avoid a ban means Ukraine's authorities make sure export produce is clean. But at the state level, a confusing array of different bodies oversees this. Environmentalists worry it's not watertight.
They're supposed to be creating a single body that would make corruption impossible. The policy is to make this a transparent institution, but that reform has not yet been passed.
Moreover, Ukraine's regulations differ from EU countries.
Now I'm looking at an herbicide in the database. Atrazine. It's banned in the EU. Let's check here. There. Authorized here for maize and sorghum.
But that doesn't mean it's authorized for export products. And exporters like Nibulon, which deals with more than 4,000 suppliers, rigorously test everything they sell.
The robots suck a sample of grain from the trucks straight into the lab.
An electronic system means the samples are anonymous to avoid any opportunities for bribery. The aim is to studiously adhere to the standards of the destination countries. Aside from traces of pesticides, the lab also scans for genetically modified organisms. None are currently authorized in Ukraine, but restrictions were only imposed relatively recently.
You do still encounter GM crops sometimes. But by now, GMOs surely account for less than 5% of all the grain grown in Ukraine. If we find any, we put it aside and export it to countries where it's allowed.
The scale of Ukraine's grain export industry means companies like this can afford to double and triple check all their products, and ill afford not to.
The farming sector today accounts for 25 to 30% of Ukraine's hard currency revenues. It's one of the most productive export industries of our economy.
When grain leaves this terminal, it is transferred to larger vessels and shipped to Europe and elsewhere. Nibulon says the risk of any of it being rejected on arrival in the destination country is simply not one that's worth taking.
Well, we're now with Spain's Minister for Farms, Fisheries and Food, Luis Planas. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Now, we've seen all through our programme that European consumers are increasingly worried and suspicious about pesticides and genetically modified crops. Is it possible to maintain the current model of farming in Spain in the face of this concern?
Effectivement, comme vous dites, c'est une question qui est à l'ordre du jour.
Indeed, as you say, this is a question that is on the agenda. I believe that Spain and all the other countries in the European Union must respond favorably to people's expectations. They expect more natural products, with less use of agrochemical products, which means it will be less harmful for the environment, and of course, 100% respectful of human health. We cannot play games with human health.
Spain stands alone in the EU as a major producer of genetically modified maize. As a minister in a newly re-elected government, do you intend to make any change to this policy?
It is a European regulation from 20 years ago, and now the production is really very limited. We are importing very large quantities from inside the European Union, but also from outside the EU.
Looking specifically at the third country of Ukraine that we just saw in our report in this programme, there are problems there with corruption, with lax regulation that allow restricted and sometimes banned pesticides and GMOs into the food chain.
I am not in a position to judge what is being done in Ukraine, but I can assure you that the European Union does function and our border controls do work. It means that if products are imported, they must respect our standards. We are very firm on this. The health and food standards of the European Union are always a priority. They are more important than the import of any product.
Now, currently, the UK is seeking a new trading relationship with the European Union. Many of the people who've been pushing the hardest for Brexit to happen are hoping to have what they call a bonfire of regulations. How big a concern is that to you?
Je crois que ça, c'est un débat interne au Royaume-Uni. J'en suis sûr que la majorité des citoyens britanniques.
I believe that this is an internal debate in the United Kingdom. I'm sure that the majority of British citizens, those who were in favor of Brexit, do not want a more deregulated agri-food sector with fewer guarantees for the consumer. But if this type of regulation were to be adopted, the European Union would of course take it into consideration. We are not going to allow products that do not meet our standards into EU member states.
Des produits qui ne garantissent pas les standards de l'Union européenne.
Now, the new president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has promised a Green New Deal for Europe with the principal aim of vastly reducing climate-changing emissions. Now, agriculture is a major producer of those emissions. Do you agree with the European Greens group, who are pushing very strongly for a reorientation of Europe's agriculture to a new model?
I agree with its direction. I think it's the right path. The expectations are high and there are many challenges. I firmly believe that the new common agricultural policy must take this new direction into account. Spain and France are leading this debate when it comes to ecological change, as well as making it one of the EU's top priorities.
Luis Planas, thank you very much.
Merci à vous.
Well, it's here in Madrid's Green Lung, the Retiro Park, right next to the Agriculture Ministry, that we will round off this programme. What future for pesticides, for genetically modified crops here in Europe? The next few months will surely tell us a little bit more. For now, though, thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you soon on Front 24.
The world is ever-changing. The news doesn't wait. That's why at France 24, we'll always be there to help make sense of world events. For the best international coverage, 24 hours a day, no matter what. France 24, with you everywhere, all the time. Liberté, égalité, actualité.